Hello and welcome to Short Stories, brought to you by the National Taichung University of Science and Technology Language Center. Today I will tell you an abridged version of the classic novel Jane Eyre. It was written by English author Charlotte Bronte, who published the novel in 1847 under the pen name Currer Bell. If you haven't heard of the Bronte family, you should look them up. Apparently, they were all literary geniuses. Well, except for Patrick. This book was widely popular at the time it was published. Even Queen Victoria praised it. Jane Eyre remains popular even today because of its innovative and engaging style of writing. I highly recommend that you read this book, but if you are too busy, you can watch one of the many movie adaptations of this novel. Vocabulary: bully, bully. Billy bullied Bob every day at school. Taskmaster, taskmaster. The factory owner was a cruel taskmaster. Humiliation, humiliation. He felt great humiliation when his secret was revealed. Abandon, abandon. My father abandoned our family many years ago. Douse, douse. The firefighter quickly doused the fire. Spill one's guts, spill one's guts. She couldn't keep her feelings inside anymore and spilled her guts to her best friend. Melancholy, melancholy. I could tell he had a bad day by the melancholy look on his face. Turn over a new leaf. Turn over a new leaf. The criminal vowed to turn over a new leaf and become a productive member of society. The story. Although I am happy now, my life wasn't always so pleasant. I was orphaned at age 10 and sent to live with my aunt, Sarah Reed, and her 3 children. I don't know why, but Mrs. Reed did not like me and always treated me unkindly. Furthermore, she let her son, John, bully me. Once he threw a book at me. It hit me so hard I fell and cut my head. I just couldn't take it anymore, so I yelled at him, "You little Caligula!" He then charged at me and we started brawling on the floor. When we were split up, I was the one who got punished. "Take her to the Red Room," shouted Mrs. Reed. The Red Room was where my uncle had died. Oh, how I feared that room. It was so small, cold, and silent. My heart started beating very fast, and I imagined that I saw my uncle's ghost. I got so scared that I fainted. After this incident, Mrs. Reed thought it was a good idea to send me to boarding school. I was enrolled in the Lowood Charity School for Girls. I thought that my life would get better, but it didn't. The headmaster, Mr. Brocklehurst, was a strict taskmaster. His favorite form of punishment was public humiliation. Once, I was framed for misbehavior, and he forced me to stand on a stool in the corner of the classroom while holding a sign that read, "Liar." I was so embarrassed I thought I might die. But there was one kind person there, Miss Temple. She was a school administrator who guided me and always had my back. After graduating, I decided to seek my own way in the world. I got a job as a nanny in a gentleman's house called Thornfield Hall. I met the housekeeper, who explained the household situation. The master of the house was a Mr. Rochester. He was abandoned by his wife, who was a famous dancer. It was my job to help raise his young daughter, Adele. I really liked Adele. She was a pleasing and obliging companion. She was docile, good-tempered, and well-principled. And her French was really good, too. However, things were not what they appeared. I didn't meet Mr. Rochester for the first few weeks. In fact, the first time I met him was by accident. I was walking to the post office on an icy winter day. As I was crossing the street, a man on a horse suddenly yanked the reins to avoid running into me. The ground was slippery, and his horse threw him off. I asked, "Are you injured, sir?" But the only reply I heard were mumbled swear words. I helped him up and said, "If you are hurt, I can get help." He shook his head, and I could see the vexed expression on his dark, stern face. "Wait, you're Mr. Rochester, aren't you?" I said. When he looked at me, his face changed, and his annoyance dissipated. "And you must be Miss Eyre, the new nanny. Mrs. Fairfax told me about you." Then he chuckled and said, "She didn't tell me you frightened horses." I smiled, and we walked back to Thornfield Hall. We spent many evenings together after that. I really enjoyed his company, and he seemed to really enjoy mine, but his happiness did not last. Gradually, I noticed some strange phenomena around the house. One night, I was abruptly woken by a strange sound. It was a low, deep, demonic laugh. It seemed to be coming from right above me. "Who's there?" I said to the cold, dark room. There was no answer. I then heard quick footsteps and a door close somewhere outside my room. I followed the sounds down the hall toward Mr. Rochester's room. The smell of smoke filled the air. I entered and was shocked to find Mr. Rochester asleep in bed, surrounded by flames. "Wake! Wake!" I cried as I shook him. I quickly grabbed the pitcher of water that was on the nightstand and doused the fire. Mr. Rochester woke up, confused and dazed. "Is there a flood?" he asked. "No," I answered, "but there was a fire. Let's get you some fresh clothes. Yours are all wet." The next morning, we discussed the events of last night. I asked Mr. Rochester if he had heard the devilish laugh. He said that he had not. His behavior became pensive and avoidant after that. Later, he suddenly announced that he had to go out of town for business. A deep feeling of unease settled on me. What happened last night? Why was Mr. Rochester acting so strangely? I said to myself. The following day, Mr. Rochester returned. This time, he had a guest with him, a lady named Blanche Ingram. She and Mr. Rochester seemed to be on rather familiar terms. I didn't like it. I asked him about his intentions for Miss Ingram. "Do you plan to wed?" I asked. Mr. Rochester looked at me and said, "If I get married, I will miss you very much. As for you, a beautiful young woman like you won't stay single for very long." I couldn't hold back any longer, and I spilled my guts to him. "I love you," I cried, "and I could never love another." Mr. Rochester took my hand and smiled. "I love you too," he said. "Let's get married." The next couple of weeks were a very joyous time at Thornfield Hall. I and the servants were busy preparing for the wedding. The dress I ordered arrived, and I took it to my room to try it on. It fit perfectly. I went to bed that night feeling giddy. Unfortunately, not everyone in that house was happy about this marriage. During the night, that strange demonic laugh returned. When I awoke, I found that my wedding dress had been torn in two. I told Mr. Rochester about it, but he just blamed it on one of the servants. That feeling of unease returned, but he assured me that everything would be all right. The day of the wedding arrived. There were so many guests, it looked like the whole town was there. I walked down the aisle to stand next to my soon-to-be husband. He smiled and took my hand. The preacher read a verse from the Bible and finally announced, "If anyone objects to this marriage, let him speak now, or forever hold his peace." Out of the corner of my eye, I could see a hand raised from among the sea of guests. "I object," said an elderly gentleman. "Good God, no," muttered Mr. Rochester. The preacher asked the man why he objected, and he said, "Mr. Rochester is already married to my sister, Bertha." My heart nearly stopped. "What?" I cried, staring into Mr. Rochester's worried eyes. He bit his lip and then sighed. "It's true," he said after a long silence. "My father forced me to marry Bertha for her money, but not long after the marriage, she started showing signs of madness." I gasped, not knowing if I should believe him or not. "Where is she now?" I asked. Mr. Rochester took a deep breath and said, "She's still in Thornfield Hall. I keep her locked up in the attic." It all suddenly became very clear to me. "So those strange sounds, the fire, and the ripped dress, those were all her?" I asked. He nodded his head. After a long pause, I threw up my hands and said, "I'm out," and left Thornfield Hall. Many melancholy months passed. I returned to my hometown to visit relatives and to set a new course for my life. I contemplated going on a Christian mission to India. But the day before I was supposed to leave, a strange feeling came over me. I felt like there was something calling me back to Thornfield Hall. I turned the page on my newspaper and gasped. There was an article about a fire at Thornfield Hall. Apparently, Bertha had set fire to the house, killing herself and injuring Mr. Rochester in the process. I rushed back to Thornfield Hall as fast as I could. I met Mr. Rochester in the local hospital. He had a patch over one eye, and his left hand was heavily bandaged. I gently patted his head. He looked up at me and said, "Am I hideous, Jane?" "Very, sir," I joked. "You always were, you know." Tears dripped down my chin as I tenderly kissed him. After he recovered, Mr. Rochester was a new man. He was kinder and more affectionate than before. He vowed to turn over a new leaf and live a more pious and honest life. Reader, I married him after all. It was a quiet wedding with just a preacher and a clerk present. We moved into a new house, a small cottage we named Ferndean Manor. It was a modest abode for a gentleman, but it was more than enough for me. We have been married for 10 years now, and we are celebrating the birth of our son. I hold myself supremely blessed. My life started out so poorly. It took many strange and unpleasant twists and turns, but in the end, love bloomed. Questions. Number 1. How did Jane Eyre feel about living with the Reed family? A. She was very unhappy. B. She liked it a lot. C. She felt ambivalent. D. She never lived with the Reed family. The answer is A. She was very unhappy. Question 2. What job did Jane Eyre find after graduating from school? A. Doctor. B. Lawyer. C. Housekeeper. D. Nanny. The answer is D. Nanny. Number 3. What was Mr. Rochester's secret? A. He was actually a pirate. B. He owed a lot of money. C. He was still married. D. He was actually a ghost. The answer is C. He was still married. Question 4. Which word best describes the ending of the story? A. Melancholy. B. Maudlin. C. Morose. D. Euphoric. The answer is D, euphoric.